I'm a lawyer, and I was living and working in Ohio. I'm from California. And I was writing op-ed pieces for newspapers. Every now and then they get published. So I wrote one about 30 years ago, and I said that racism is no longer a major problem in America. And that I talked about the number of blacks who are in the middle class, the numbers of blacks who become doctors, lawyers, presidents of universities, and so forth. I get a phone call from a producer of a radio show. He said, "Are you black?" And I said, I think so. He said, "Will you come on my guy's show tonight and talk about your article? Because it was pretty extraordinary." I said, "Sure." I was on for a whole hour. Now that I'm in talk radio, when you have a guest on who's never been on before and you have him on for a whole hour, that means he's rocking. And during that hour, I was called an Uncle Tom. I was called a bootlicking Uncle Tom, a foot-shuffling bootlicking Uncle Tom, a bug-eyed foot-shuffling bootlicking Uncle Tom. I was called a coconut, as in brown on the outside, white on the inside, Oreo. I was called the Antichrist. And then I was called that name you really call a black person when you really, really want to cut him. I was called Republican. A man can only take so much. So I get back to my office, the phone rings, it's the station manager. He said, "You were amazing today." I said, "I was?" "Oh my goodness, you have a good speaking voice. You took difficult positions and you defended them without losing your sense of humor or your temper. Have you ever thought about doing talk radio?" I said, "No." He said, "I have a guy going on vacation. Will you sit in for him?" I said, "No." He said, "What's the problem?" I said, "I really don't like being called a bunch of names. I don't like being yelled at. I don't like having other people yell at me." He said, "Are you married?" At the time I was. He said, "Do me a favor, go home to your wife, talk it over, and call me back tomorrow, and maybe you'll change your mind." I said, "I'll talk it over with her, but I doubt that I'll change my mind." So I went home and I mentioned it to my wife, and she said, "Well, what do you think about talk radio?" I said, "I know very little about it. I mean, I knew who Howard Stern was, I knew who Rush Limbaugh was, but I never listened to talk radio." And I said, "It just seems like it's shallow, glib, and stupid." She said, "It is. You'd be good at it." So I did it, and of all the names I've been called, rarely am I called the name that I really fear the most, and that is wrong. Rarely am I called wrong. When I talk about the number one domestic problem in this country is not racism, it's not income inequality. I'm not saying these things don't exist, but the number one problem in this country is a growing number of kids brought into the world without fathers. When I was in college in 1970, my first year, we read a report by a guy named Daniel Patrick Moynihan called "The Negro Family, a Case for National Action." At the time, 25% of black kids were born outside of wedlock. He said there are going to be all sorts of social problems because of that. We need to do something about it. Fast forward, now over 70% of black kids enter the world without a father in the house. 25% of white kids now enter the world without a father in the house. 50% of Hispanic kids do. It is far and away the number one social problem in this country. Obama, not Larry Elder, Obama said a kid raised without a father is 5 times more likely to be poor, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, 20 times more likely to end up in jail. What's happened is we have incentivized women to marry the government with our welfare state, and we've allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. We all have a moral obligation to not bring a child into the world until and unless we're prepared to feed, clothe, house, and educate that child. And that's on us. It is not, however, a death sentence when you are raised without a father. My father does not know his father. My father and I had a very difficult relationship when I grew up. I thought my father was mean. I thought he was an ogre. I thought he spanked us too hard, too often. And the thing that really bothered me the most about my dad is that something would tick him off, and then the same thing the next day would not tick him off. So he couldn't even understand what it was that bothered him. Unfortunately, my dad started a little cafe when I was around 10 years old, so I had to work for him. Didn't like working for him either. He'd scream at me when things would go wrong. I thought he was ill-tempered. Now I'm 15 years old, and I said to myself, the next time this SOB yells at me, I'm going to walk out of the cafe. I would like to tell you, I said, the next time this SOB yells at me, I'm going to go up to him and I'm going to say, "Now see here, you and me, let's talk about how we can go forward with a civil relationship." But I was afraid of my father, so I walked out. The waitress had called in sick that day, so it was a crowded little diner, 16, 18 people, but my dad had to work it all by himself. He came home, he was furious. He said, "Why did you leave?" And I said, "Dad, I got sick and tired of the way you spoke to me." My dad paid me $10 a day plus tips. He balled up the $10. He threw it at me as I lay on my bed. He walked out of my bedroom. We did not have another conversation for 10 years. And when I say not a conversation, I mean not even, do you think it's going to rain? How about those Dodgers? Nothing. And it was easy to avoid him because he worked long hours. I went to high school, and I was able to avoid him. I graduated from high school. I go to college on the East Coast, go to law school in the Midwest. I end up getting a law firm job in Cleveland, Ohio. 25 years old, making a lot of money. I should be living large. And I can't sleep. And I know I can't sleep because of my relationship with my father. And I called my secretary and I said, cancel all my appointments. I'm flying to California. I'll be back in 3 or 4 days. I didn't tell my mom and my dad I was coming because I didn't want my dad to prepare for this meeting. I walk into the cafe. I had 2 big bags. My dad was surprised to see me, of course. He said, should I put your bags in the back, Larry? I said, no, Dad. I'm only going to be here for 5 or 10 minutes. I want to tell you something. I assumed that the conversation would last about 5 or 10 minutes. I was going to tell him what an SOB I thought he was. And I figured he called me an ungrateful son. Maybe I'd be able to sleep then. So I sat there for an hour. The restaurant closed at 2:30. I got there at 1:30. And I said to myself during the hour, now, Larry, don't tee off on the man. Don't tell him everything he's ever done. Don't tell him every whipping, every spanking, every slight. Don't do that. Just give him the highlights. So the man sat down, and I teed off on him. I told him everything he'd ever done, every whipping, every spanking, every slight, everything. I spoke for about 20 minutes nonstop. You guys know how I can rock. And my dad, after 20 minutes, I'd run out of ammo. I couldn't think of anything else he'd ever done, anything else he'd ever said. I was done. And my dad looked up and said, is that it? You stopped speaking to me for 10 years because of that? And I said, yeah. He said, let me tell you about my father. Now, I must tell you, I knew nothing about my dad's background. I mean, I knew he was an only child because we never got any Christmas gifts from anybody. Aside from that, I knew nothing about my dad's life. I didn't like him anyway. I didn't give a damn. So I never had a conversation with him about his life. He said, your last name, Larry Elder? I said, yeah. He said, that is not my biological father's name. I said, what is your biological father's name? He said, I have no idea. I never met him. You never met your father? I said, no. I said, who was Elder? Elder was the boyfriend who was in my mom's life the longest. He was an alcoholic. He was physically abusive to her, physically abusive to me when I would try and stop it. But she had a series of boyfriends, each one more irresponsible than the other one. My mother could neither read nor write. My dad said, I don't even know what my birth date is because she couldn't write it down in the Bible. I know that the year, but I don't know the date. And I said, well, then what happened? My dad said, one day I came home at the age of 13 years old, and I started quarreling with my mom's then boyfriend. She sided with the boyfriend and threw me out of the house, never to return. 13-year-old black boy, Athens, Georgia, Jim Crow South at the beginning of the Great Depression. I defy most of you to find somebody who had a hand dealt like that. I said, well, Dad, what did you do? I went down the road. I took any job I could get. I ultimately became a Pullman porter on the trains. They were the largest private employer of blacks in those days. And my dad said for the first time he was able to walk into a restaurant and actually get served. He was out in California. And my dad said I always took 10 cans of tuna and crackers with me because you never knew in the South if you were going to be able to get a meal. But here I could walk in and actually get a meal. So my dad said he made a mental note, maybe someday I'll relocate to California. Pearl Harbor, my dad joins the Marines. He was the first black Marines. They were called the Montford Point Marines. They were the equivalent of the Tuskegee Airmen. They were tough people. And my dad served on the island of Guam during World War II. And when the war was over, my dad, by that time, had become a staff sergeant. He was in charge of cooking facilities. My dad could look at a cake and tell you what's in it. He's that good. He went back to the South when the war was over, to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he had met and married my mom, and he wanted to get him a job as a short order cook. And he was told by restaurant after restaurant after restaurant, we don't hire niggers. My dad said, I was in the war. We don't hire niggers. He went to an unemployment office. The lady said, you went through the wrong door. Go through that door. My dad sees the colored-only door, goes through that to the very same lady who sent him out. She was just telling him what the rules were. My dad came home to my mom and said, this is BS. I'm going to California, get me a job as a cook, and I'll send for you. My dad goes to L.A., which is where I'm from, walks around for a day and a half, and he's told, I'm sorry, you have no references. My dad said, but I cook for, I'm sorry, you have no references. They treated him the same way in California. They were just a little more polite. My dad went to an unemployment office, this time just one door. He said, I'll take the first job that you have. It was a job cleaning toilets. My dad cleaned toilets at a company called Nabisco Brand Bread for 10 years, took a second job with another bread company called Barbara Ann Bread, full-time job, cooked for the weekend at a white family in a place called Pacific Palisades, and went to night school 2 or 3 nights a week to get his GED. The man never slept. 15 minutes here, 45 minutes here, an hour here. You do that, and then you walk into a house with 3 rambunctious boys, I had 2 brothers, and see what kind of mood you're in. The man was tired all the time, physically tired. He wanted to have a stay-at-home mom, and therefore he worked those kinds of jobs because he wanted my mother to be at home with us. So as my dad is speaking, my dad got bigger and bigger and bigger, and Larry got smaller and smaller and smaller. And now I'm crying. And I said, Dad, please forgive me for feeling the way I felt. And my dad said, there's nothing to forgive. Just follow the advice I've always given you and your brothers. Hard work wins. You get out of life what you put into it. Larry, you cannot control the outcome, but you are 100% in control of the effort. And before you whine and moan about what somebody did to you or what somebody said to you, go to the nearest mirror and ask yourself, what could I have done to change the outcome? And finally, he said, no matter how hard you work, no matter how good you are, sooner or later, bad stuff will happen. How you deal with that bad stuff will tell your mother and me if we raised a man.
Hey everybody, this is Charlie Kirk, founder and CEO of Turning Point USA. If you liked this video, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel at Turning Point USA.